Hello, BookTube. Well, it's the very last day of October, and that means, among other things, uh, Victober is ending. A venerable BookTube event where we celebrate all things Victorian, the great literature of the Victorian. So much fun. I've been participating partly by doing a read along of The Way We Live Now by Anthony Trollope with Jordan Parsons. I've been celebrating partially in an informal way off camera by reading Oliver Twist for the 8 millionth time, continually hoping that the penny will drop and I will suddenly understand why everybody loves Dickens. And my read along, this is probably my 104th read along of read through of Oliver Twist, and it did not work. Now I'm not done yet, but it is not working. But another thing that I've been doing that I just sort of fell into in October was to read Victorian poetry to you. Not every day. I took a break, but I thought we'd finish out Victober and October by by me reading you another poem. Uh, and I was contemplating, what to do. What poem should it be to round out Victober? Uh, you've got all these towering Victorian poets, right? I've got the Penguin Book of Victorian Verse with all sorts of names, big and small, all throughout here. And I was thinking, Tennyson or Yeats or whatever, anybody from either end of the Victorian spectrum. And then I thought, no, there's one Victorian poet that has to finish things for me, and that's Rudyard Kipling. Rudyard Kipling is in distinct disfavor right now. He will never be coming out of disfavor, uh, mainly because I would say ultimately the 30,000-foot explanation for why he will never be back in favor as an author is because explicit virulent racism is now an accepted dogma in academics. A trickle in high school, but colleges are as far as I can tell, the literature departments of colleges are entirely ruled by explicit virulent racists. And Kipling spent a lot of time in his creative output talking about the Victorian Empire, colonialism, white man's burden. And it's easy to take that sort of thing, all of which from Kipling's pen was incredibly complex, and simplify it. It's what the number one thing, aside from hatred, that racists do is to simplify things, oversimplify things. So I don't think Kipling will ever be coming back, but in the Victorian era, he was a huge name. I would argue probably none bigger, except maybe a couple of sentimental, sappy Christian poets that we don't remember at all. They're not remembered even in controversy. Kipling was huge, though, and as we've gone through, we've talked about Kipling on this channel a few times. His relationship to the British Empire was fraught with complexity. He knew perfectly well that he was living through history. The British Empire was the greatest empire that the world had ever seen, the most amazing thing of human governance that the world had ever seen. And a lot of Britons knew it at the time. Kipling knew it, and towards the end of his life, especially after he'd been battered a little by critical setbacks, he sort of viewed himself as at least, if not a spokesperson of that complexity, at least duty-bound to speak of it, whether he had any kind of official standing or not. He has developed over the decades of the 20th century a kind of stance as a jingoistic, tub-thumping, imperialist apologist that is not the kind of spokesmanship he would have wanted. I think he would rail against it if he were allowed on campus today. But I want to read you a poem of his to round out Victober. I had a great time reading these things to you. I've had a number of you email me and say, well, even when Victober ends, could you read us a poem every day? I've also had a number of people... another event for October was Book Trek 2021, where me and myself and a few other booktubers are reading Star Trek fiction. And for October, we're reading Deep Space Nine, the novels about the show Deep Space Nine. And I started out with the best of intentions, and the novels just kept getting worse and worse. I was reading them every night. I was calling up a new one and reading it every night. And every night I was just incredibly baffled by the badness of the fiction. So I decided, just as a lark, that I would do Book Trek 2021 for October by reading excerpts from other things, just other things, just that I picked at random. And October is ending. My dalliance with Deep Space Nine is ending and will never be taken up again. We're moving on to Star Trek Voyager, and I know from memory that a lot of Star Trek Voyager novels are actually worthwhile. I'm sure I'll have plenty to talk about. And a lot of you know that too, because I'm getting a lot of emails saying, well, we know you like Voyager more than Deep Space Nine. You're bound to like the novels more than the crap you've been reading. but we kind of like the readings too. Could you continue those as well? I don't know how many daily videos I can make without breaking YouTube. But one way we can at least finish out with a poem, with a Kipling poem. There are many, many that I could do, but I want to pick one that I kind of like, mainly because of its complex relationship to its subject. You would never read this, of course, in school, because your literature teacher is an avowed, open racist, not someone who's hiding these things so that when they get together they talk about how all white people are infested by evil spirits, but people who say this to their class and expect it to be in the exam. So you're never going to read this poem at school. But I thought I'd read it to you just because it shows the complexity of what I'm talking about. This is his famous poem, The Widow at Windsor. And the tiny, tiny bit of historical background here to set you up is that the widow, of course, is Queen Victoria, whose husband, Prince Albert, died, and it upset her world. I talk on this channel all the time about how you can grieve in a healthy way, or you can grieve in an unhealthy way. Victoria grieved epically unhealthy. Her grief for Albert was a morbid fetish, almost from the beginning, and it just became that way. She dressed in widow's weeds for the rest of her life. She was secluded at Windsor Castle for a huge amount of time, when that's actually unconstitutional, and it was even in her day. If you're the monarch, you're not allowed to do that. But she did anyway. She just disappeared from public life for a long, long time. Preserved his room exactly the way it was, his hairbrushes exactly the way they were, all that sort of nonsense. All the signposts of unhealthy grieving, with no one to tell her otherwise, because you're Queen effing Victoria, so no one can tell you otherwise. She just cauterized that way. But that's the Widow of Windsor that's being referred to here. And the poem is narrated by one of her endless foot soldiers, the endless redcoats who went everywhere. And Kipling writes it orthographically, just the words on the page. He writes to evoke a kind of Cockney accent. I am not going to try that myself. We'll just read it as is. Have you heard of the widow at Windsor, with a hairy gold crown on her head? She has heaps on the foam, and she's millions at home, and she pays for us poor buggers in red. Oh, poor buggers in red. Every stanza ends with a parenthesis, a line in parentheses that is an exclamation to echo, to emphasize the last segment of that stanza. There's her nick on the cavalry horses. There's her mark on the medical stores. And there's troopers you'll find with a fair wind behind that take us to various wars. Poor beggars, barbarous wars. That stanza referring to the fact that there was an imperial war office mark on the horses, a nick in the ear or a brand on the hump. There was a mark on all the food stores and on all the tents and all the material and all the weapons, every kind. Then ears to the widow at Windsor, and ears to the stores and the guns, the men and the horses that make up the forces. Oh, Mrs. Victoria's sons, poor beggars, Victoria's sons. Walk wide of the widow of Windsor, for half of creation she owns. We have bought her the same with sword and the flame, and we've salted it down with our bones. Poor beggars, it's blue with our bones. Hands off of the sons of the widow, hands off of the goods in her shop, for the kings must come down and the emperors frown when the widow at Windsor says stop. Poor beggars, we're sent to say stop. Then ears to the lodge of the widow, from pole to the tropics it runs, to the lodge that we tile with the rank and the file, and open in forms with the guns. Poor beggars, it's always their guns. We have heard of the widow of Windsor, it's safest to let her alone. For our sentries we stand by sea and land, wherever the bugles are blown. Poor beggars, and don't we get blown. Take hold of the wings of the morning, and flop round the earth till you're dead, but you won't get away from the tune that they play to the bloomin' old rag overhead. Poor beggars, it's 'ot overhead. Whenever, however they roam, heirs all they desire, and if they require, speedy return to their home. Poor beggars, they'll never see home. And the speedy return is in a coffin. And we see that all the time in Victorian literature, where characters have been to wars or been hurt in wars or come back from wars. I just love that poem. I just think it's fantastic. I don't know that I think you would have to read it for the full theatrical effect in a dialect like Kipling wrote it. I can't do it justice like that. But I love the foreboding. The narrator is one of those foot soldiers of the widow. He is one of the sons of the widow, Victoria's sons. He is one of them, and has seen the whole world with that bloody red flag overhead. And warns that this is a dangerous thing. Walk wide of the widow at Windsor. Best not to have anything to do with her, because otherwise she'll send us. And no matter how high and mighty you are, we'll wear you down. We'll bring you to the table. We'll make you obey. Don't touch the goods in her shop. Her lodge, the lodge of the widow of Windsor, is not Windsor Lodge. It's not Windsor Castle. It's the whole of the world. It's a fourth of the landmass of the world. And yet, there's, in my opinion, to my ear anyway, no celebration here in that at all. The widow at Windsor. I don't think it celebrates any of the things that it talks about. I don't think that it's holding out the pity of the soldiers in a sarcastic way. In other words, I think it's totally genuine. I think it reflects a lot of complexity on the part of Kipling towards the thing that people who criticize him without knowing anything about him say he cheered uncritically. And that's how we're going to end. That's how we're going to end this particular iteration of Victober, which can't get away from politics, right? A Victober event, a Victorian literature event that tried to get away from politics, would be doing it was an intensely political age. And the politics were all very dirty. They were very, very dirty. But I think we've covered a wide spectrum here of Victorian poetry in this month, and I've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed it quite a bit. The suggestion that I read you a poem every day that it doesn't have to be Victorian. So many of you emailed and said, I know that might get boring, but it doesn't have to be Victorian. You can read something else. I don't know. I don't know. I will be pondering November's videos tonight when I'm not writing for NaNoWriMo. But I wanted to wrap this up for now. I hope you all had a great Victober. It's been a ton of fun for me. And I'm gonna end this video for now, but I'll be back. We'll certainly be talking about Victorian things between now and the end of the year, since they're the greatest. Good or bad, dirty or pure, they're the greatest. So I'll wrap this up for now, but I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.